Again, welcome everyone. You are attending NYS TESOL, TESOL's B-MEIS, Bilingual Multilingual Education Intersection Joint Panel Discussion titled, Should We Expand or Diminish the Role of Assessment for Multilingual Learners? My name is Qing Lin. I'm the president of NYS TESOL. With me here as moderator for this webinar, for this panel event, are Dr. Zhongfen Tian, the current chair of B-MEIS, and Dr. Clara Bowler, the immediate past chair of B-MEIS, who will host and organize a Twitter chat following today's webinar. As an introduction, assessment probably is one of the most treacherous frontier for all the equity-oriented school reform efforts, and where exists where all the hidden curriculum such as monolingualism, deficit-based school practices reside. It's treacherous also because its role in shaping and dictating the curriculum design, classroom instruction, and all other aspects of the school practices, as well as its high impact on the equity issue relating to multilingual learners. Despite its importance, transforming assessment policy and practices can also be extremely challenging because it is a multifaceted and multi-dimensional issue. And through today's webinar event, what we hope to do is to move the needle a little bit toward more equity educational practices. We want to thank all the panelists being here today. They have dedicated their lifetime scholarly work to this or related topic, and we are so honored to have them here. And we especially want to thank all of you in the Zoom here for taking time from your busy schedule to join us for this discussion. It is our hope that this discussion will become part of a movement where we continue to expand a circle of social solidarity to sustain our equity-oriented efforts moving forward. So as a follow-up, this webinar will be recorded for a broader distribution and will be published as a newsletter piece. And we will also host a Twitter chat to further this conversation. Select responses from today's chat and the Twitter chat will be included in the newsletter as well, so that we can use it to engage conversation with our colleagues, administrators, and parents, and hopefully continue to create a change at the policy level. So now, without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Zhongfen Tian to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Xinjing. I have to stop sharing this in order to see my notes.
Okay.
Well, the good thing is we can see each other's faces. I think that's a positive thing. So hey, everybody, I'm the current chair of the Bilingual Multilingual Education Intersection of the TESOL International Association. It is my great honor to introduce today's panelists. So Dr. Laura Sanzi Moreno is currently a professor and the bilingual program coordinator in the Childhood Bilingual and Special Education Department at Brooklyn College. Her research is focused on literacy development of emerging bilinguals, the literacy assessment of emerging bilinguals, and the development of teacher knowledge and how these intersect with equity. Dr. Luciana de Oliveira is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Studies in the School of Education and a professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on issues related to teaching multilingual learners at the elementary and secondary levels, including the role of language in learning the content areas and teacher education. Dr. Jamie Shizel is Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her research focuses on assessments, policies, and teacher education regarding linguistically and culturally diverse communities. Through historical analysis and participatory action research collaborations, these projects emphasize relationship building to inform actions that challenge multiple modes of oppression. Dr. Aida Waikui directs the National Research and Development Center for Improving the Education of English Learners in Secondary Schools at WestEd, where she started one of the agency's signature programs, the Quality Teaching for English Learners Initiative. This initiative focuses on the development of educator expertise to support elementary and secondary English learners' development of conceptual, analytic, and language practices in disciplinary subject matter areas. Qingqing, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zhong Fentian, for the brief and sweet introduction. So previously we sent out a call for question and then a call for selection and ask people to help shape today's agenda. We thank you. We want to thank those who have contributed to this effort and contributed to the pool of questions. After careful reading through the question, we consolidated those questions into 4 questions. So in the following, we are going to ask each panelist with each of those questions in turn. So the first questions, okay. The first question is, what are the core principles of culturally responsive assessment practices that honor and build on multilingual learners' diverse, rich, existing linguistic and literacy backgrounds, experiences, and practices? So each panelist will have about 4 minutes to respond to this question. The question will allow each panelist to briefly share with us their basic principle that underline their educational philosophy, and later on their broader and more in-depth responses to each of other questions. So we will start with Dr. Oshenzi Moreno, who is also one of the plenary speakers of this year's NYS TESOL annual conference.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to the New York State TESOL leadership for putting this webinar together. I'm so excited to be in conversation with the panelists and also the audience members. So thank you. When I think about this question about what are the core principles of culturally responsive practices, I think there are many, but I'm going to focus on 2. And the first one is, I think that it's important for all teachers to view assessment as a curricular space. So often, assessments are positioned outside the orbit of the teacher and de-emphasize teacher knowledge, teacher expertise, and in general, just professional know-how. And they steer teachers away from what they know and how they know about students. So often teachers are positioned as implementers of assessment, even when they're formative assessments, and they're lauded for their procedures and their procedural fidelity. So if they're giving a formative assessment, what is valued is not what they know about bilingualism, about students, about reading, and putting those all in conversation and in combination with each other, but rather of implementing procedures with fidelity. So I really think that especially this is an issue that's important for all teachers, because all teachers have this relationship with assessment in that it's something that's handed to them. But I think it's particularly troublesome for teachers of emergent bilinguals because, as we know, assessments are often monolingual instruments. And so if teachers of emergent bilinguals cannot implement their professional knowledge and then use assessments as a curricular space, then emergent bilinguals are further disadvantaged. The second principle, and I'm sure our other panelists will talk about this more in depth, is ensuring that there is a multilingual and multimodal approach to assessments. In the article I wrote about responsive adaptations, my main point is if we want to know the heart of what children know, then we need to insert an approach where, for example, we use translanguaging to understand how children read. And the example I'm going to give is if a child reads a text in English, but yet we ask the children to retell only in English when they could retell and demonstrate their understanding in Spanish, then we're not assessing their reading comprehension. We're assessing their English proficiency, for example, about reading. So I think it's really important that we develop multilingual and multimodal ways of understanding what children know. And I'm going to stop here so that the other panelists have time to speak.
Thank you. Dr. TESOL?
Oh, thank you so much, Chin Chin. Thank you everyone for being here today. And I want to kind of echo what Laura was saying. It's just amazing to be in communication and in conversation with this amazing panel. So I hope to do these questions justice. I also love the format that you solicited questions and then had people vote on them. I think that this is a really innovative way in order to talk about these topics, especially assessment maybe, because it's such a top-down field. Assessment and policy may be in conjunction with each other. And so this question kind of gets at that really well, that because culturally responsive assessment practices are definitely not a top-down endeavor, right? Like these are works that are done in collaboration with, in conversation with. They're not static, they're not fixed. You can't just like map them onto a standard and then have it be done, right? Like this is a constantly like evolving, somewhat nebulous area of assessment, which is exciting, but also can be a bit overwhelming at times. And so for myself, because I don't actually in my work use specifically this idea of culturally responsive assessment, I wanted to find a resource, and I found, not necessarily that I know to endorse this, but I found this to be helpful to kind of wrap my head around, specifically if we're talking about culturally responsive assessment and different principles. One way that one organization has talked about it that does resonate with me is the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment. So I put the link in the chat for everyone to look at as well. I just want to highlight a couple things from this. And it's mostly this idea, they have, look at my visual again. They have 6 different kind of pillars. And for me, what I think is actually one pillar that they put kind of to emphasize on its own, but it does stretch across every single one, is this idea of relationships. And in the work that I've done, the way that I've framed this is really looking at user-oriented assessment, or really focusing on who's taking the test, why are they taking the test, do they care about the test, or the assessment practice, and how to collaborate with test takers, with that different community, not just in the United States, but also internationally, different multilingual communities across the globe. And really putting the test taker, instead of designing the assessment specifically to meet the standard, designing, theorizing, conceptualizing, developing, implementing, and interpreting the assessment, always with the test taker in mind, and sometimes also like hand in hand with the test taker, right? So depending on the different levels of students that you're working with, finding different ways of having them be an integral part of every step of the process, especially for formative forms of assessment. Some other ways that you might see culturally responsive assessment practices talked about in the assessment world, just to kind of also kind of, I don't know, prompt you to, if you start to see these things or if you've seen these things, think assessment for learning. Any kind of literature on that starts to touch on this as well. And also there's a whole group of scholars that do ungrading. And so ungrading is a whole movement where there's just no scores, right? No point values, nothing attached. There's much more of a focus on intrinsic motivations and very expansive ways of having students demonstrate their learning. And what does that mean for multilingual learners? I think it goes back to what Laura was saying. So especially this multilingual, multimodal aspect of it. The multimodal part being something that maybe isn't always operationalized very clearly in standardized tests. So we might not have a good idea of how to picture it, but we see it every day in classrooms. So we see it every day in communities where people are just being, and the ways that they are being can be seen as a form of counting in assessment. So I think I'll leave it with that. But thank you so much again for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. TESOL. Next, we're going to invite Dr. De Oliveira to share your thought with us.
Yeah, thanks and welcome everyone, and thanks again, Ching Ching and John Feng, for the invitation to be here. Just a disclaimer, assessment is not my area of research or work, but I have taught about assessment in my TESOL methods classes. And so I come here as a teacher educator, as an instructor who has taught many times TESOL methods and has incorporated assessment, of course, as a very important topic in whatever it is that we're discussing in methods courses. So in terms of culturally responsive assessment practices, I think it's important to start with a definition, right? So think about not just the core principles, but what are those culturally responsive assessment practices? And the way that I see them, they are the kinds of assessments that draw on students' cultural strengths and extend their practices. And so we might think about the question, why do we assess? So as teachers, you might be thinking that all the time. You might think about how we assess students to find out what they have learned and to help guide our classroom decisions. What else do I need to address, revisit, add? And so more classroom-based assessments are really important to prepare our multilingual learners for standardized testing. And we often equate assessment with tests. And I want to problematize that today because assessment is much more than tests. So how can you work, for example, to prepare students for standardized tests, right? So how can you work on, for example, I'm a big, I focus a lot on my research on language patterns, right? So what are some important language patterns that are common in standardized assessments to help our multilingual learners understand what they're asked to do, etc. So those are some important considerations. Another point that I wanted to make right from the beginning is one that Margot Gottlieb makes in her book, Assessing English Language Learners, is that we can see assessment with three different lenses: assessment of learning, which is usually what we know. Sometimes standardized tests are assessments of learning. So that helps us use evidence of student learning to assess achievement. So that's more commonly known as summative assessment. We also have assessment for learning. And so that involves teachers using evidence about students' knowledge, understanding, skills to inform our teaching. And that's more commonly known as formative assessment. And one less commonly known, I guess, aspect of assessment is assessment as learning. So this really focuses on students being their own assessors. They monitor their learning. They ask questions about what it is that they're learning. They use a range of strategies to think about what they know and what they need to know more about, what they can do. So it really helps students gradually take responsibility for their own learning. And so this assessment as learning should be viewed from a perspective of their strengths as learners. So these are three key areas that I think we should be thinking about as we are discussing assessment practices in general. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. De Oliveira. We hope to hear you to unpack assessment as for of learning later. So the last speaker we're going to invite to share thoughts with us is Dr. Aida Waiki. Her name needs no introduction, and so Dr. Waiki, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by reiterating the feeling that all of my co-panelists have shared, and that is that appreciation for organizing this opportunity to discuss ideas around such a weighty topic, which is the assessment of English learners, but also for the pleasure of sharing with colleagues, both in the panel and participating, and getting to know where we all stand and pulling our strengths together for the benefit of our students. I think an important consideration beyond principles when we go into assessment is that assessment needs to play an important role in a system that is equitable for our students. And in this sense, there are two important dimensions of equity that it would be important to unpack. The first one is fairness, and the second one is inclusion. And of course, these are definitions that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development espoused in the year 2012. Fairness means ensuring that personal and social circumstances, for example, gender, socioeconomic status, language status, are not obstacles to educational achievement. And I'll come back to that in terms of what assessment does wrong. And fairness means that we ensure that, and inclusion means that we set a basic minimum standard for education that is shared by all learners participating in the system, irrespective of their background or personal characteristics. So we have right now a system, and would it be possible to share the slides of the two triangles? But right now, the assessment system nationally is one, can that be shared or not? Otherwise, I can describe it.
Dr. Zhongfen, could you please, Dr. Zhongfen Tian, could you please assist?
Thank you. So currently, if you kindly click on slide 1, the current system of assessment is one that is fully dominated by large-scale standardized assessment for English learners. And that drives all other types of assessment that English learners receive. For example, although large-scale assessment includes more than standardized testing, for example, they talk about benchmark testing as well, all the different types of testing that emanate from the system are testings that serve the purpose and coincide with large-scale standardized assessment. We have, for example, the case of states that devote months for students to prepare to take and ideally to pass large-scale standardized assessment. But because these assessments, which should be used exclusively with the purpose of large-scale accountability, by nature, they are very atomistic. They test individual items. It doesn't really at all give us a sense of what students can do with language, what actions they can engage in. And so classroom-based assessments in this system, unfortunately, end up being at the service of large-scale assessment. Instead, can we please go to the next slide? What I would like to propose, and in fact, it is part of work that we are conducting at the center, is that classroom-based assessments constitute the majority and the bulk of the work that students go through in assessment. And that is the work, for example, of formative assessment, where both teachers and students together are aware of how development is taking place and can track it, and then can determine what should be the next horizon of learning together, teachers and students. And I am echoing already ideas that Luciana and Laura have talked about. And so in this new system of assessments, there still is a need for large-scale assessment, because that's what principals, administrators look at. They want to take the temperature of whole systems, schools, districts, but in reality, it is the classroom-based assessment that determines and helps inform what that large-scale assessment should be. And so large-scale assessments are based on notions of language learning that we have gone beyond in practice. Notions that we learn language sequentially, that language is formed, and as has already been mentioned, language is simply a tool that helps us act, do things in the world. And we do that in multiple ways, not just talking, not just using grammatical sentences. We do use grammatical sentences once in a while in life, but for the most part, we use ellipses. We use a lot of many other practices that really would not make it into standardized assessment. So we need to think of what we want is to create citizens, to help develop citizens who can be critical, who can communicate, who can understand others, who can respond to them, who can probe ideas, and reducing it to language is not how we get there.
Thank you, Dr. Waiki. So thank you, each speaker, for your insightful response to the first question. I can't wait to hear more about how we can dive deeper into each subtopics. So next, I'm going to ask Dr. Zhongfen Tian to moderate the second questions.
Thank you, Qingqing. Also, thank you, Qingqing, for putting the questions in the chat box. So the second question is, how can we effectively and accurately collect and analyze student growth as it relates to bilingual development and translanguaging practices? So this time I will invite Jamie to speak first.
Thank you. I feel like this is a pretty tricky question because the idea of trying to understand what bilingualism is or multilingualism is really depends on your theory of language and language development. Do you see it as a unitary system? Are you trying to work towards specific goals within each language which do approximate monolingual standards? So very tricky. Thank you so much for having me go first. I really appreciate that. I think more than anything, these words effectively and accurately are really relative. And maybe trying to understand the limitations we have that we're facing. And so, especially when we're talking about pre-established proficiency scales, right? So most of the time, the proficiency scales that we're working with are used across states, across countries, across the world. And just knowing that sometimes in our need to communicate what bilingual development means to a broader audience. So for example, I'm thinking of the Common European Framework of Reference which is a scale that's used internationally and is used for professional development a lot for, or professional certification for teachers of English. And knowing that, like, if you just say, oh, C1 or B2 for your level, it's everyone kind of has an understanding of what that means. But really, in terms of trying to understand that's usually a level in just one language, right? But trying to understand bilingual development is, there's the advantages of having a way to communicate it that is understood widely, but there are the massive disadvantages to that as well. And I don't know that I can say too much about that without it just kind of continually sounding messy. This is why, again, I think what we've all been talking about is the different scales of how we're talking about this. If we're talking about it like small scale and within a community, if we're able to develop it, there's a lot more options available to us. But when we're talking about large scale testing, the goals, the aims, start to introduce a lot more limitations and problems in what we can say and do. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jamie. Luciana, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. Those were great points and highlight the complexities. I'm going to try to be brief because I'm looking at time. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that it's important to match your teaching practices with your assessment practices. So thinking about, again, the point of assessment for learning. So what are you trying to find out? We know that there are states that do not support bilingual education, bilingual development, but this does not mean that you as a teacher should not support bilingual development and use translanguaging practices. Every teacher, this is something that I've learned over time through reading a lot and engaging with a lot of the work on translanguaging, is that every teacher can use translanguaging practices and make use of students' home languages in the classroom. There are a couple of resources that I wanted to share with you. One is there is a focus bulletin put forth by WIDA focused on translanguaging. I'm going to drop that link into the chat box. And the other one is actually somebody who's in the audience today, is a book by Tatiana Klein and Ofelia Garcia, The Translanguaging Classroom. I'm going to add the resource there, Translanguaging with Multilingual Students, Learning from Classroom Moments. So that one has lots of classroom examples, things that you can do as a teacher. And it also includes some ideas on assessment as well. I'm also including the link to the website for the book. So that's what I'm going to say.
Thank you, Luciana. Aida, over to you.
Thank you. If we follow the rationale that I started talking about, where the majority of the assessment work is done in the classroom and within learning, then it's very easy really to look at ways of collecting data on whether students are learning or not that are both teacher and student responsibility. For example, when children arrive the first day of classes, it would be nice to have a little recording on a task. You know, tell us some fantastic story you've ever heard and what happened there. Because you're preparing students to go into the first big component on mythology. But then as activities unfold, every so often, there is a more comprehensive activity that students are invited to do. So for example, they have worked on the myth of Phaeton, and now they're working on Arachne. How do you see the two characters? What were their characteristics? What happened to them? What did they learn? And what was the purpose of the myth? What was it trying to illustrate for people who listened to the myth at the time? And so it's those collections every so often of kind of summative activities that students stop every 2 months and review. And so they see what is, for example, the level of interconnections across ideas that I presented on my first example, and that I am gradually growing and developing across time. What is the logic of the argument that I'm making? Is it clearer as we go through? So there are rubrics that explain how an accomplished reader, writer, speaker develops over time. And that is the part that, unfortunately, this over-reliance on standardized testing has eliminated in teachers' ability to appreciate. Mothers, parents do it naturally. They see how their kids are growing. They see how their kids' speech is changing. They notice if the child is ill and needs some help because they're always observing. But the power of observation is one that is eroded when teachers have to be concerned about correctness, standardized testing, appropriate use. And I won't take more time because I tend not to notice how much I talk. Bad problem, right, Tatiana?
Aida, that was beautiful. I do think teachers are or should be like anthropologists of children and really understand their growth across time. I'm going to build on very quickly two principles. What Jamie said about assessments need to reflect our worldview and align to our conceptualizations is really important. So if we believe that reading is something that involves multimodality, then our assessments encompass that. We can only see an assessment limits what we can see. So if we have very narrow assessments, we only see a little bit of our children. What Aida is talking about is having these broad assessments where we can see the child within their context and within the context of learning. And I think that's really beautiful. And we need to capitalize on that because that's what teaching is all about. We need to translate our assessments to teaching, not assessment for assessment's sake. And one thing that I just want to add to the conversation is I've been really inspired by our colleague, Kate Mahoney's work. She has something called the PUMI framework, which is purpose, use, method, and instrument. I think teachers need to have clarity about what they're measuring. So, for example, if you're measuring reading, then a translanguaging approach is valuable because you can understand students' reading comprehension regardless of the language they use. But if you're assessing children's English proficiency while reading, then you need to take a different approach. And you need to say, well, in this assessment, I really want you to try your hardest to, speak in English or vice versa in Spanish. So we need to be really specific about what we want to assess. And I guess when I heard that question about biliteracy, I think it's really important that teachers ask themselves, well, what aspects of biliteracy do I want to look at over the long range, and make sure that you have a variety of tasks so you can see their development along a variety of ways that they demonstrate their biliteracy and bilingualism.
Thank you, everyone. So through each response, we kind of get a glimpse into the complexity of this overarching topic of assessment, especially its role in the broader sense of student learning and supporting students, supporting our equity efforts. So the third question actually going to help us to dive deeper into why we ask assessment and its role in a broader social cultural context. So the question is, due to the multidimensional nature of supporting multilingual learners, how are cultural values, ethics, custom practices for multicultural learners supposed to be assessed so that we can assure that instruction and ongoing classroom assessment are seamless, purposeful, and meaningful? For this question, we're going to invite Luciana to take a lead in answering, in exploring this topic for us.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I had to reread the question a few times to really understand what it was asking, and I'm still not 100% sure that I really understand what it's asking, but I'll take a shot. So what, in terms of thinking about this multidimensional nature of supporting multilingual learners, I would go back to our first question and what it means to use culturally responsive and culturally sustaining assignments. So those are assessments that account for the values, positions, knowledge that our multilingual learners bring to the classroom. So in other words, their cultural identities. This means we are adapting assessments that allow students the opportunity to bring their own cultural backgrounds and experiences into how they demonstrate achievement, right? So I think that it's also important to make a distinction between being culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining, as these terms are sometimes used interchangeably and they're not interchangeable. So I wanted to mention that. And so culturally relevant relates to relevance to students' lives and experiences. So you may want to think about culturally relevant texts that you're using, depending on your students' backgrounds, language, etc. Culturally responsive relates to how we adapt our instruction, how our schools adapt to this new population of multilingual learners, sometimes in states that are new immigrant states. So multilingual learners are sources of knowledge and have many assets that should be used as they're giving opportunities to bring these into the classroom. And culturally sustaining, which is a term that actually New York State uses, culturally relevant, culturally sustaining frameworks. So relates to how we not only draw on multilingual learners' assets and knowledge, but how we extend them as well. So culturally sustaining pedagogies build on the popular concept of culturally responsive teaching, but they go beyond the act of making content relevant to students and responding to their cultures. So Paris in 2012 stated that it does not necessarily help, quote, sustain and support bi and multilingualism and bi and multiculturalism. So thinking about just responding, right? So this notion of culturally responsive teaching, that we need to focus on culturally sustaining pedagogies that help support, quote, the cultural and linguistic competence of communities while simultaneously offering access to dominant cultural competence. So Paris advocates for a pedagogy that maintains the practices of students while also expanding their repertoires to include, quote, dominant languages, literacies, and other cultural practices, end quote. So students are also able to critique such practices. So one of the goals is to help perpetuate and foster linguistic pluralism as part of our efforts in working with this multilingual population, which is a crucial goal in the education of multilingual learners. So that's my best effort at answering some of that.
Thank you, Luciana. Next, we will invite Aida for sharing your thoughts. Yeah.
Yes, and I would like to discuss two ideas. The first one is the multimodality of communication. If we walk into a classroom, we tend to see, if students interact with each other, that they're not even looking at each other. They're usually reading a paper as they say something to the other. And so I think the multimodality comes, for example, in posture. It comes in kinesics, body language. You know, like when we're talking, we're not just talking. We are moving our hands, we are moving our faces, we are checking on you. And that is all part of communicative competence. And so students, for example, doing very brief videos of themselves, and now with their phones, they can just record themselves for 1 minute in response to a question, but trying to do it naturally as if they were talking to somebody. And once again, looking at that development unfolding over time can be very useful, or seeing two students interacting with each other. How do they grow in their interactive ability beyond words and into bodies and space and deities? And the second aspect that I had not planned to talk about, but that Luciana has brought, is this notion, so thank you, Luciana, that culturally sustaining also means a very important theoretical stance on cultures. And that is that cultures are not static, but they are always in flow. They're always evolving. So it's not about working with our students around Mexican culture, as if there was a book that encapsulated what Mexican culture is about. But Mexican culture is unfolding in multiple ways across multiple localities. And so helping students see how they themselves are creators of new cultures, how they themselves are the actors that lead the change in society. And that is a very important aspect that needs to be assessed. So I think this critical stance and critical participation is essential.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you,
Absolutely.
Aida. Laura, over to you.
Yes, I think building on what Aida has and Luciana are mentioning is that there's also children's culture that's apart from, let's say, national or ethnic cultures. Children have their own culture where they find interests in small groups that are apart or different from their parents. And it's really important to get to know them on their own terms as well. But this question also confused me a little bit, because I don't think about it as assessing cultural competence, but I think about it as collecting information. So I think it's important that we collect information, just as we started talking. I think it's a thread across all four of us, but to get to know children deeply and their families. Another thing is, I always found as a teacher that sometimes teachers talk about children as if they're independent from their families and communities. But even though we only have the physical presence of children in our classrooms, their context is also deeply affected by their families and communities. And therefore, we should get to know them as well. So what are some ways that we can get to know our families, communities, and children, and how they're all intertwined? We can invite parents into the classroom. We can ask them surveys. We can observe children. We can get to know them, not only their school literacies. We haven't even talked about this. Teachers often just get to know children's school literacies, but may bypass, for example, that there are many out of school literacies that are happening in that child's life and that are important to school. For example, one thing that I'm thinking about is I had a student, well, I have many students, but one of the students who is a bilingual undergrad at Brooklyn College came to do a panel, and he said, everyone assumes that my language is Spanish, but really, no, it's not. I'm from Guatemala and I speak X language. I forgot which language. But unless we tap into that, we do not know kind of the full span of that child. So I think we need to collect as much information as possible from the person by observing, by asking questions, and also tap into out of school literacies that may impact in school literacies.
Jamie?
Sure. Instead of I think I just agree with everyone, so I'm not going to repeat what everyone is saying. I'm going to do a little historical anecdote to kind of explain how entrenched the idea of trying to make sense of what culture and how culture interacts with testing is. And I'm going to take us back to early days of standardized testing, and this would be when eugenic motivations for intelligence testing were explicit and said very loudly. There was no trying to hide it under a statistical method or under a particular type of construct or theory behind the test. So I'm thinking of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests. If you're not familiar with them, they were used in World War I to kind of sort out the different draftees and recruits for the US military to see how, in what capacity they were going to serve during World War I. And it's the first large scale standardized test in modern standardized test used. And in terms of how they talked about culture back then, Carl Brigham, who was at the time of writing this in 1923, or when it was published in 1923, a very vocal eugenicist, talked about it that basically if the tests used, these Army Alpha and Army Betas, had some mysterious type of situation that was typically American that they were also measuring in addition to this idea of measuring intelligence, that we meaning not us, we, and exclusively we, them, are indeed fortunate, for this is America, and the purpose of our inquiry is that of obtaining a measure of the character of our immigration, right? And so just kind of this idea that culture is embedded in all of our tests, like all of these different ways, and trying to figure out what we mean by it and how it's being used when it's not explicitly talked about and it's not explicitly framed or understood in a really direct way. A lot of times it does fall back into entrenched systems. I think Aida was talking about the relationship between assessment and systems. That's really important. And often those systems are not beneficial to people who are from different marginalized backgrounds. And the systems I'm really thinking of, right, are like systemic racism, white supremacy, colonialism, that's still kind of all attached with this. So just kind of knowing that this has been an issue that's ongoing. And so what we're trying to do right now is really important, but it's in the face of now over a century, right, of these kind of entrenched ways of how culture has been conceptualized within assessment frameworks.
Thank you, Jamie. For the last question, I would like to ask each speaker to be very mindful about the time. Please limit your response to 1 or 2 minutes. I'm going to ask Zhongfen to facilitate with the last questions. Thank you,
Sure,
Zhongfen.
thank you, Ting. Yeah, I think the last question is about action and hope. So it says, so what are some ways for school districts to rethink assessment policies in a concerted effort to minimize the negative impact of standardized testing for multilingual learners as we continue to move toward asset-based approaches to education? So I will invite Aida to respond first.
I think there is a lot that districts and schools can do, not to minimize, but to challenge and somehow put in its place the role of standardized testing by prioritizing formative assessment where students are in control, realize they are growing all the time. They are becoming increasingly stronger intellectuals as they go through the schooling system. And it is a shame, in fact, that 2/3 of all English learners in secondary schools are students that have been exclusively educated in American schools. That is a scandal, because it means that these students have been in English classes for 8, 9, 10, 11 years. And so it means that what we're doing is not working. So why not, as used to be the case, we have education as a subversive activity? Now, part of that subversion is to say to kids, look, kids, we have a game and it's called standardized testing. And this is the way it works. And we just have to jump the hoops. But most of the time, we work on valuable things. And the more you work on intellectually rigorous, deep stuff, the easier it'll be to jump the hoop. And we'll play 2 days on how to jump those hoops. I think that's what schools should do. And I could talk for 3 hours about this. There was my 1 minute.
I think we lost Laura. I think because
Oh,
of
no.
internet connection. Is she still here?
I don't see her.
Jamie, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I would say specifically for reclassification, we're in a little bit of a tricky spot because there are federal policies that have to be followed. And we're in a little bit trickier
All have to
spot.
be followed. So many
Yeah.
federal policies are not followed.
Yeah, we're in a little bit trickier spot because there used to be some wiggle room for reclassification policies around students that were duly identified as English learners and with disabilities in terms of how to factor reclassification. But currently the discussions are about getting rid of those policies and making all policies kind of blanket across the EL classification. I think the only additional comment I have is trying to remove or trying to make EL classification not be a gatekeeping classification, right? So practically in schools, really using that not as something to use for tracking, but something that really can be seen as away from deficit positioning of it, right? And more towards more asset-based positioning.
Thank you, Jamie. Luciana?
I'll try to be brief as well. So I wanted us to challenge the question a little bit. So it implies that standardized testing has a negative impact on multilingual learners. That's quite interesting, just the way that it's phrased. And so I started to reflect on that and think about something that I mentioned at the beginning of our session, which is equating standardized testing with the word assessment, right? So I remember hearing somebody, I think it was Deborah Crusan, who is an expert on assessment, say that assessment is not the big bad wolf, like many people seem to think. And so my message to kind of think about is that assessments can really help us make decisions, think about what else needs to be addressed in our classrooms, show us what our students are learning, and so many other things. And so we need to help change this perception of the A word, right? And perhaps not the A word that you're thinking about. I'm thinking about the A word as assessment, as sometimes, people not wanting to discuss issues of assessment. So I want us to as Aida mentioned, challenge a little bit our notions of assessment and their roles and their role in its role in our classrooms.
Thank you, Luciana. Over to you, Laura. Glad you're back. Oh, I think the internet seems I think her screen got frozen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. About Laura's internet connection. As I said, that due to the connection, complexity of this issue, what we today is to help lay the groundwork and to continue to build the conversation. So we thank you, everyone in the audience, for your comment and question you put in the chat. At this point, I already enabled the mute button, disabled mute button for you. However, for the constraint of time, we won't be able to take any questions. Instead, we're going to save the chat and select some of them to include in the newsletter piece, along with the transcript of this recording. And we will continue this conversation in a follow-up Twitter chat that is going to be organized by Dr. Claire Bowler, who is in the audience. And again, we will select responses to publish in the newsletter piece. And you will receive an invite to participate in a follow-up email. So I thank you everyone for attending today. And at this time, I'm going to stop recording, but we will all be here for a little bit. So if you have any questions, please feel free to stay and join us a little bit. Otherwise, thank you. Thank you for coming despite your busy schedule.